Hello and welcome to the Spike podcast. I'm Fraser Myers and as ever I'm joined by Tom Slater, Spike's deputy editor and host of the Last Orders podcast.
Hello.
And Spike columnist Ella Whelan.
Hi.
This week on the show, George H.W. Bush, the fall of Emmanuel Macron, and Peter's war on meat-based metaphors.
President George H.W. Bush, the last president from the greatest generation.
But he was a good man. He was fundamentally a decent man.
As America pulls back under Donald Trump, Friday marked that sharp split. We remember his life and his tremendous legacy and how his approach to leadership stands in stark contrast with the politics of today.
George H.W. Bush, 41st President of the United States, died last week. The one-term president was derided in his time, but his obituaries have been more generous, hailing him as a model of civility and integrity. Tom, what do you make of these sudden reappraisals?
When, in some respects, they're always inevitable, of course, when a president dies, especially one who was president at a very significant time in US history. There's going to be a more generous assessment, shall we say. There's going to be more attempts to kind of not speak ill of the dead, I guess, is a pretty normal instinct. And also, we have to remember in Britain, I think, that the US presidency is treated with a certain amount more deference and sense of being revered as an institution, as being head of state, than perhaps we might expect from a prime minister dying, etc. That said, I think the response has been interesting, not just because it's been overly generous in many places, which it has, a stressing of how honest this man was, how civil he was, many nudges and winks to the fact that the current occupant of the White House isn't any of those things. But also there does seem to be this kind of binary response. Either he was this wonderful man or he was, evil, a warmonger, all of these different types of things. I think what we're kind of seeing is a lack of an attempt to really look at him in any real depth. I mean, Frank Bruni wrote quite a good piece for New York Times talking about whatever happened to Shades of Grey, and George H.W. Bush is a Shades of Grey type president. He saw at the end of the Cold War, but did so with not very much aplomb, it's fair to say. Famously, when the Berlin Wall fell, he said it was a good development. And when pushed by the press as to why he wasn't more excited, he said, "I'm elated, I'm just not an emotional kind of guy." He was in many respects a foreign policy president, but really approached that as a kind of managerial role, not there to upset the apple cart too much, to kind of manage the changes geopolitically that were going on. But then again, I think the attempts more recently in the last couple of days to actually, call into question the fact that he was this kind of, perfect president that someone was making out is entirely understandable, insofar as we saw this with the death of John McCain recently, whereas there is this concerted effort, because Trump is supposed to be held up as this completely aberrant, evil president, to really do everything they can to present everything that came before him as far more unimpeachably brilliant than actually was before. So I get the tendency, particularly by some on the left more recently, to try and knock down this more kind of genteel, wonderful image that is being presented to them.
It was interesting reading the kind of, like Tom says, reading the eulogies. It's the usual stuff, but there's a lot. I found that it was more about Trump than about Bush, even if it was in a kind of subtle kind of a way. So I read something in the New York Times that said, the death of George Bush, is this the end of America as it used to be and should be in the future? Harking back to what the golden time of not so long ago, when life wasn't so much better, in relation to, you just look at the kind of things that Bush did, even at a very small level on an issue like abortion. He's got some similarities with Trump. So he was previously pro-choice, then decided he wanted to be president more than he cared about his pro-choice values, and took on board a quite aggressively pro-life position from that point. It's exactly what Trump has done. People criticise Trump for a negative campaigning. Bush engaged in that as well. We talk about Michael Dukakis. Kevin Yule's written a piece in Spiked detailing how, in order to win an election, he went very hard on some of his opponents. So the whole idea of this being, a celebration of Bush and his presidency and his son crying at the funeral, which is, understandable, but it all had really heavily laden underneath it the idea that this was a kind of what America should be, and Trump is what America should not be. I mean, even the case of the BBC detailing the funeral and how it happened, and making a lot about the fact of who Trump shook hands with, where Trump sat, it's very obvious that this is about Trump rather than about the guy who's died.
And there's definitely double standards here, because what's really interesting about Trump is it's not to say that people don't criticise him for his policy decisions. Of course they do. But there is this tendency to talk about him on this kind of moral level, on the level of him being uncivil, on the level of him being brash and rude, and how that is almost of a piece with everything bad that he's done. But as Ella was just saying there, if you wanted to talk about some of the most negative things that are thrown at Trump, you could easily build a case that George H.W. Bush is as guilty as these things. As you were saying, the race against Dukakis was not only incredibly negative, but also was incredibly racially charged. So the presidency race in 1988, Bush's notoriously kind of scurrilous campaign chiefs really pushing this story about Willie Horton, who was a black convict who was released on a kind of furlough program in Massachusetts, where Dukakis was governor, and ended up murdering someone and then raping his girlfriend repeatedly. Horrible story, but was used very much to associate this kind of aberrant black convict with this ACLU liberal. That was effectively what they were trying to do. We hear a lot these days about how, Trump inventing alternative facts and lying endlessly and misrepresenting things. But what's interesting was in 1980, when Bush was running for the presidency for the Republican nomination against Reagan, he really laid into him on the basis of his economic plan. He called it voodoo economics. He said this is a nonsense. And yet, as soon as a few months down the line, Reagan picked him as his vice presidential candidate, he denied ever having said that. And to the point where he said, go out and find me proof, which people did. And then his team claimed that he was just joking when he said it. So this idea that, again, that Trump effectively invented lies and spin when he came into the White House.
All politicians were honest and good
until
2016.
It's just obviously completely ridiculous. There's a lot of discussion right now about, is Trump going to, pardon Paul Manafort, his former campaign director, who is obviously being put through the legal ringer at the moment. At the end of George H.W. Bush's presidency, he pardoned a bunch of people who were implicated in the Iran-Contra scandal, of course, which also implicated him. So that's the thing about the nature of trying to present Trump, and he's entirely moralistic, and everyone else who came before him as the kind of antithesis of him, that there was this goodness in American political office, which he's just completely corroded. It's not difficult to build a case that, they're as bad as each other, effectively.
And of course, the other parallel to this was the recent death of John McCain, which you alluded to earlier, Tom. As most of us understood, this is one of the most hardline warmongers in American politics, which takes some doing, frankly. There practically isn't a country that he hasn't called for the invasion of. He stood against Obama for president. But when it came to his death, Obama says, we were on the same team, we were in favour of the same things. And that does kind of raise the question of, why did you stand against this person in an election if there is no great overarching difference? It shows actually how similar the establishment are behind this kind of great lie of political difference and of kind of culture war anger.
Yeah, I mean, John McCain's funeral was described as a meeting of the resistance. Purely because Trump wasn't there. But yet this is the kind of world of US politics. Everything is defined by its relationship to Trump. So you can have someone like Obama giving a eulogy to someone like John McCain and it being sort of seen as normal, when in any other situation you'd think, what? These people were completely opposed.
And you might kind of expect it, I guess, with Obama. He is part of the liberal establishment, I guess. But then you even have figures like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who is supposed to be this great hope of the left. And she described McCain as an unparalleled example of human decency. So that's going beyond not speaking ill of the dead.
And it seems that both with the death of George H.W. Bush, but also, as you say, John McCain, you hear a lot of this discussion about the politics of consensus, that we're effectively in a new age now in which bipartisan politics, in which a more gentle, polite kind of politics is really at an end. But you do have to ask yourself the question, why is that such a bad thing? Because again, when you look at the kind of circus really that McCain's funeral turned into, with everyone kind of taking their chance up at the podium to take pot shots at Trump without ever naming him, all of the media excitement around that from nominally very liberal to progressive outlets, what you're effectively seeing is an establishment. What's kind of interesting about George H.W. Bush through to Obama is that they're kind of two different kinds of aristocracies, really. And it's interesting how easily they can meld. So, of course, George H.W., this kind of product of New England privilege, Yale grad, again, part of this kind of very wealthy, genteel aspect of Republican society. And then you have the Obamas, who are again more of this kind of new clerisy, this kind of professorial class, this kind of liberal establishment. And yet I think what the outpourings of affection for both HW and McCain kind of show is that those two things are actually incredibly similar. And that the reason they hate someone like Trump is that in his own blundering, uncouth and often quite grim way, he challenges that consensus. And that seems to be the thing that they're most afraid of.
You're listening to the Spike Podcast. If you're enjoying the podcast, why not give us a rating and a review? It really helps people find the show. Up next, Emmanuel Macron. French President Emmanuel Macron was hailed as the saviour of Europe, but his approval ratings have plummeted, and now he's facing the most significant protests in France since 1968. Ella, what went wrong for Macron?
What's gone right for him? And I say that with great pleasure, because I think lots of people like us are watching the Gilets Jaunes protests and kind of cheering them on. I mean, we talked about this last week. This began as a kind of protest among some French people against hikes in fuel prices. There was sort of people from all sides of the political divide being involved, but this has kind of spiraled, and now the protests are getting bigger, they're getting more serious, and importantly, Macron has started to clamp down on them quite brutally. So we've got reports of not just tear gas, water cannons, but rubber bullets being fired at protesters. 2 people have died. Yes, there's a lot of violence coming from the protesters' side, but the response of Macron to clamp down on these protests has been really, really shocking. And he has had to take a step back in relation to the planned fuel duty rise. First, he said he was going to take it away for 6 months. Now there's a U-turn, it's going to be removed for at least a year. But there's no sign of the protesters stopping. I think quite rightly they feel like they've got him on the ropes and they should keep pushing. Fraser, you wrote an article on Spike this week about it, about how, lots of people do condemn the violence that's happened within the protests, but 72% of French people are behind them. Yes, this is a row about fuel prices, but more generally, I think it's come to express a deep desire to kind of challenge Macron, challenge his way of politics, and challenge the kind of idea that a technocrat like him can come in, essentially railroad over French voters, just say, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to make France a really great place for wealthy businessmen. I can't see this as anything more than a really positive grassroots kind of challenge to the European elite, which Macron basically symbolises.
Yeah, that's right. There's always been so much more excitement for Macron outside of France than within it. And, lots of people have been excitedly retweeting Vince Cable from a couple of years ago saying that I can offer the same formula as Macron, as if that is somehow an attractive prospect.
No, definitely. I think what's kind of interesting is, first of all, the level of surprise from commentators that Macron is as unpopular as he is. And it's not even just a case of reading runes, it's just a case of reading the polls. In his election, his much vaunted election, there were a record 3 million blank votes in the legislative elections that followed. It had the lowest turnout in the history of the Fifth Republic. And of course, when you were considering who he was up against in the form of Marine Le Pen, it's quite clear why people would endorse him over the effective successor to a neo-fascist party. I mean, there was a Ipsos study which found that just 16% of his vote was actually an endorsement of his programme, and 43% of it was about just opposition to Marine Le Pen. And yet the kind of love bombing of him is so intense that they seem entirely blind to this. But I think the point that Ella makes is really important insofar as deep down, that's not really what Western liberals wanted from Macron. They didn't necessarily want a man of the people. They wanted someone who would not necessarily, win the argument against populism, but someone who would use the power of his position to kind of force through the things that needed to be done to reform the Eurozone, to put things back on an easier footing, to push through the kind of reforms that they felt that the French economy needed, etc. And he kind of embodies that entirely, this very kind of kingly persona he has, summoning all of the MPs to Versailles in the manner of Louis XIV. He is this kind of, as Politico once put it, a liberal strongman, and that's why they've always liked him, and why I think ultimately they were blind, or actually not that bothered about how unpopular he was from the beginning of his presidency.
Much of his time in power has been concentrated on foreign affairs and the European Union. But the problem is that even leaders in Germany and other parts of Europe are recognising that if he cannot keep on top of things at home, then he has absolutely no authority to pursue his ambitions in the European Union.
I think this is the tension that's always been there within him, that he doesn't particularly want to be the French president. He wants to be the EU's golden boy. He wants to, that's where his interests lie politically, not necessarily with popularity at home.
Macron's relationship with the public is testy at best. He has always been very haughty whenever he comes across members of the public. So, you know, there's one famous case of a young gardener says he can't get a job. Youth unemployment is really, really high in France. You know, it's about 25%. Unemployment in general is at 10%. And Macron just says, you know, if I walk over the road, I can get you a job. It's easy. I know loads of cafes who've got work. Just go there, you know, chop, chop kind of thing. And even when he's trying to, you know, be nice about poor or working class people, he was giving a speech to a group of techies, and he said, you know, you can't forget about the left behind people. And he goes on to this really bizarre metaphor of the train station. You know, life is like a train station, and there's a whole mix of people. There are some people like you, successful people, and then there are the people who are nothing. And so I've been pleased to see some of the Gilets Jaunes have been holding up signs, you know, saying, we are the nothings, you know, coming back to get you. He just has this kind of monarchical style, and it's completely bizarre that he was ever feted by, you know, people who call themselves liberal or even centre left in the first place.
One of the things I think is really interesting was a lot of the discussion around the time of his election was about how he was actually a product of the anti-establishment backlash.
Yeah.
He was an example of how you could do it from the centre, how you could challenge the political elite who everyone is really angry about, but guide it, as these people would see, in a far more liberal and constructive kind of way. And what's kind of interesting is that he's a kind of perfect case study of a third-way politician. He obviously wanted to emulate Blair, insofar as third-way politics, kind of technocratic politics, centrist politics, does try to respond to a mood of anti-politics, of a mood of anger. You know, En Marche would go around talking to people on the doorstep. Macron in the campaign labelled himself the kind of nation's therapist. I want to know what's ailing you. But at the same time, we saw this with Blair, we're seeing this with Macron as well, it's an attempt to exploit a mood of anti-politics to actually, rather than what the populists might want to do as far as put more power in people's hands, it's to take more of it away, to do what needs to be done. And the fact that not only did he take on this almost cartoonish, monarchical kind of affect after his election, but also his moves to try and shore up the power of the executive by kind of fiddling around with the powers of Parliament, his push for more Eurozone integration, despite the fact dissatisfaction with the EU has been higher in France even than in Britain for quite a long time. I think it's that interesting kind of paradox of the technocratic third way, which is to say it tries to harness an anti-establishment mood, but to a thoroughly kind of establishment agenda. And what I think is interesting about the Gilets Jaunes protests is it shows that whilst that might have worked 10 or 15 years ago, it's certainly not going to work now.
Spiked has no paywalls and no subscriptions. It's contributions from listeners and readers like you that keeps us fighting for freedom and democracy. If you'd like to make a donation, just go to spiked-online.com and hit the donate button. Up next, PETA. The animal rights group, PETA, want to persuade the public to stop using anti-animal language. They argue that phrases like flogging a dead horse contribute to a culture of speciesism which downplays animal cruelty. So they've even created some exciting alternatives, like bring home the bacon should be bring home the bagels, be the guinea pig should be the test tube, kill two birds with one stone. See, this doesn't quite work for me. It says feed two birds with one scone, and I pronounce it scone, not scone. So it doesn't rhyme. Take the bull by the horns, take the flower by the thorns. I mean, what do we make of this?
Oh, it's hilarious. No, but what's kind of funny about it is that I'm sure we might have noticed this recently, that is groups like PETA, vegan campaign groups, etc., have been trying to very proactively kind of adopt the language of, for lack of a better phrase, kind of social justice campaigning. And to really, what's interesting about this is effectively a list of animal microaggressions, which is funny when you're talking about animals who can't understand language in the same way. So it's this incredibly bizarre attempt to kind of co-opt that agenda. But what's kind of interesting about it is that despite the fact that, you know, veganism is very popular right now, you could say that animal rights is kind of on the up. It's quite trendy, especially amongst the groups of people they're trying to appeal to with this kind of ridiculous campaign. This is the point at which they overreach. Actually, you know, when you hear vegans compare, you know, farming and livestock to chattel slavery, when you see people try to compare dairy farming to industrialised rape, even the most solidly PC student activist thinks, hold on a second there. And I think the backlash we've seen to this hilarious graphic shows that even they're capable of kind of pushing the boat out too far a little bit.
It's kind of an example of where isms go mad. I mean, speciesism is really crazy, but we spend a lot of our time criticising, the kind of things like I remember lists coming out about gender neutral pronouns. So don't say post-man, post-man, say post-people, don't say policeman, say police officer, all that kind of stuff. And this is sort of in that line. However, I do think that there's something in some people have been saying, you're comparing the struggle of animals to the struggle of black people or women. Hang on a minute. Now, I don't want to get into that whole kind of offence scenario, but there's something in that the idea that you could compare animals' lives, animals' consciousness, animals' feelings to that of human beings is pretty insulting.
It is a racist comparison or a sexist comparison or a homophobic comparison when it's made. I don't think we should shy away from
I'm sure that it's certainly racially insensitive. I think that's quite clear. But the only thing is I think there's a kind of partial response to it, because I think this whole idea of speciesism is horrendous on the face of it, insofar as I don't think it should be particularly controversial. And I think people deep down know this, to put human life on a higher pedestal than animal life.
Yeah.
And I think anyone who, in that kind of Sophie's Choice situation where it's like you can either kill the lamb or the baby, anyone who has to think twice, I don't want anywhere around me. That's terrifying. So there is, but what's kind of slightly irritating about the backlash to this particular campaign is that it's purely on the basis of this is offensive to the minority groups, or this is offensive to this. It's offensive in general, because it's effectively trying to say that human suffering and animal suffering are exactly the same thing. But you're right in to say that it is particularly grim, ugly and boneheaded when you see these kinds of comparisons being made. And also that PETA have got form for this. In the early 2000s, around 2003, they launched this kind of exhibition come protest installation called The Holocaust on Your Plate, which was effectively putting up big hoardings of pictures of people in concentration camps next to pictures of, slightly ropey looking calves and things. And there was this immediate backlash. They almost couldn't understand it. But of course, I think the thing about these extreme examples is they really get to grips with the centre of the kind of animal rights idea, which, although people might be quite fond of animals, quite not want them to be mistreated, etc., when people like PETA go around effectively trying to put human suffering and animal suffering on a complete par, that's the point at which people say, hold on a second, and rightly so.
It's interesting that I think I've heard more about vegans and animal rights and vegetarianism and militant veganism in the past sort of couple of months than I ever have.
Yeah.
And it's interesting to think about why that is, because you've kind of, in the rolling progress of the kind of, as you have described it, Tom, the social justice kind of campaigns, the isms coming out every day, the kind of ugly wars within transgenderism, within other areas of identity politics, sort of natural that this would come out as well as another way in which you could seek offence, argue about offence, and mount a campaign as ridiculous as something like militant veganism. But you have to think that it kind of shows where we're at in relation to offence culture, identity politics. Even this is kind of being described as an identity politics for animals, because it's been encouraging that the backlash against it has been so widespread, and so many people are saying, for God's sakes. At the same time, it's also interesting to note what a huge amount of media attention it's got. So it's a kind of example of how, as well as this speciesism, lots of other isms get a huge amount of attention, cause a huge amount of fuss. In reality, their effects and their influence on most people's lives is so very minimal and, barely enough to make them chuckle. So it's a good example of, for me, an encouraging example of how sensible the British public are in relation to just saying, for God's sakes.
You've been listening to the Spike podcast. If you enjoyed the show, why not give us a rating, a review, or even a donation? For your daily dose of Spiked, go to spiked-online.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week.